This is Andre Cohen, and welcome to another episode of Speaking of Diversity and Inclusion at Mayo Clinic. So as we look at this kind of social ambiguity that we're currently experiencing, this social distancing, what we don't want to distance ourselves from is from our values and from our principles. And so when we think about how we're interacting in the world, it's important to figure out how do we hold tight to those, given some of the stigma, some of the, again, ambiguity that we're seeing in our society, right? And how do we not look at human beings as scapegoats for things we either don't understand or don't control? And so this particular conversation really circles around how do we become allies for one another in these times of uncertainty, in these times of misinformation or fear or the temptation to scapegoat. So let's get right into this conversation. I look forward to seeing who you become as we continue to talk about diversity and inclusion here at Mayo Clinic. All right.
So you are here if you are in the right spot. Thank you. This is the Everybody In or Everybody Inclusion. And we wanted to take this time to really start to address stigma and fear. And hopefully you've had the chance to see the communication that came out or the article that came out yesterday morning on the News Center that Mayo's perspective on stigma and fear and the impact it has on our Asian Americans colleagues today. So Andre and Allie and I wanted to take this time to share with you kind of high level some of the things that we're seeing and how we can all be better allies in this conversation and addressing these issues. But then we wanted to spend the bulk of the time turning it over to you and listening from you and hearing from all of you what some concerns you might be seeing or hearing are in the communities or within Mayo walls, even the virtual walls that we sit in today. And what can we be doing as Mayo colleagues to be supporting each other during these times? I want to start off with this quote. As we work to control the spread of COVID-19, we must also control the spread of hate during this pandemic. And why we chose this quote was the fact that as you think all the way back in the early stages of COVID-19, in February, what we saw was that this spread of hate and discrimination and ignorant attacks, whether it's small or big, everything from spitting on someone to physical attacks, we saw this slowly grow over that time period, right? Not only physical attacks, but then you started seeing the business impact it had on these communities, where a lot of Chinatowns and Chinese or even just Asian businesses were being targeted and also not being visited and patronized because of simply the fact that they were Asian. And regardless of the Asian that they were coming back or the background that they came from, we were seeing this impact across the nation. And the most recent kind of last few weeks here, there was a new site that started collecting these. And within the first week of opening that site, there was over 700 reports from across the nation. So when we think about this is an isolated incident, this is not an isolated incident. When you have colleagues within Mayo, in Florida, in the health system, in Rochester, in Arizona, in Wisconsin, you name it, are also seeing and feeling some of these things as well. And so that's why we decided this is an opportunity for us to bring all of us together and have a conversation around this particular issue. And really, it's born out of this stigma, fear, and ethnocentrism. And so I'm going to turn this over now to Allie and give him an opportunity to share a little bit about this.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Lord. Great introduction. And if we can go to the next slide. What we really wanted to talk about was kind of how do we get to the micro assaults that were evidenced in those different headings of those articles that were out there, and how do we then begin to really understand what's going on? And you've heard the term stigma. And stigma really is that negative clutter that you see above this young lady's head. But I love this graphic because sticks and stones may break my bones was something we used to say when I was young. But words will also hurt me. And a lot of times these words or these thoughts are coming from or perpetuated from an uninformed standpoint. No one knows the person in this photo, but we're quick to throw those types of words. And in the case of our Asian colleagues, some of the words that have been uttered or shared in public with someone that you're a friend with behind someone's back, they really do bring about hurt, and they're projected onto someone or something. And that's the stigma action that as we work backwards across the continuum, that it results in the micro assault, but it comes from stigmatizing a group or an individual. And when we think about that type of hate and how it's thrust upon people, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the oldest and strongest emotion known to man, and that is that term fear. And that's the brain's ability to always want to solve something, to complete it. And in the ambiguity of the absence of an explanation, our brain begins to create a narrative, or people's comments create a narrative. And those negative comments actually drive us towards the stigma that then begins to evidence itself with micro insults, or then it may progress to a micro assault, as you saw in there, to where it's verbalized and it's vocal to an actual physical assault. So fear and ambiguity really are the drivers of the stigma that then we see now that's being evidenced against the Asian community in America right now. With that, I want to transition to Andre.
So one of the things that is important for us to recognize is ethnocentrism, right? So we all come from a particular context with a particular worldview. And if we're not critical in our thinking, we will believe or we will operate in the world as if ours is the only way of being and the only way of thinking. And so I like this diagram, this graphic, because it really exposes not only what ethnocentrism is, but how do we resolve ethnocentrism? Right. And if you can just type in the chat room, what would be the tool or mechanism that could help us solve this particular problem with ethnocentrism? Open and honest dialogue. Yes. What else? Asking questions, having open perspectives, having empathy, trust, changing your point of view, education, tools to solve things, walking in other people's shoes, take a higher perspective, and seek first to understand before being understood. All right, go ahead, Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Individuals. So that obviously are some steps that we take. But when we are acting on stigma, as Ali was talking about before, the smallest part of our brain, the primal part of our brain, is actually operating, and so our prefrontal cortex is not being engaged, right? So how do we move from operating from the primal center of our brain to actually moving to the prefrontal cortex, or the more sophisticated part of our brain? Well, we have to recognize that there's a movement or a shift that can happen, right? And we'll decide whether it should, depending on our goals, but it certainly can happen. And so ethnocentric means that I'm living on one end of the spectrum that is very centered on me and my worldview as the center of all things. And then there's another end of the spectrum that becomes this idea of ethno-relative, that my way of being is alongside other ways of being. Right? So I'm not the primary source, or my group isn't the primary source. And so when we think about movement in growth and development, what we're really seeking is to move from this kind of homogeneous, meaning that all of the group is the same, or monoculture, or that one culture is the defining feature of all things, to really looking at heterogeneous cultures, right? So having groups that are mixed up with lots of different people, that they're intercultural, right? And so on the lower end of the spectrum, in this ethnocentric end of the spectrum, we have the denial of difference. We have the defense of difference. We even have the minimization of difference. And sometimes this end of the spectrum can be stated or people can use statements like this that indicate where they are on the spectrum. I don't see color. People are people to me. We're all humans, right? And while those things may in fact be true, those limit our ability to get to the other side, which is to actually recognize that color does exist. But it's the meaning that we give to colors or difference that becomes important. And so when we look on the other end of the spectrum, we see acceptance, adaptation, and integration. And integration should mean that we both bring something to the table that creates a third way of being, right? And so this ethnocentric worldview and this ethno-relative worldview becomes the things that we strive for so that we don't get stuck. And so that ambiguity and that fear does not take a hold of our ability to make sound and effective decisions that assure that the needs of the patient come first. And so how do we do that? We have to do that. Particularly at Mayo, what we lean on is our principles and our values, right? So the needs of the patient come first. That's an easy and simple thing to remember and to keep in front of us. However, the values are what fuel us to make sure that those needs come first, right? And so there's a whole training that we have on our ODI website about diversity as a statement of values. That diversity is a statement of these particular values. And I do find it interesting when I first came and people would talk about diversity and they would say that it's only respect, when in fact, diversity is all through every one of our Rich Ties values, right? So diversity is in respect, it's in teamwork, it's integrity, it's in innovation. The more I'm able to include different ideas and different thinking, the more innovative my ideas will be, and compassion, and excellence, and healing, and stewardship. And so as we not only lean on these values, if we use those actually as operating principles, then the fear and ambiguity will still be there, but we can inform our decisions based on our values and on our principles. Ali.
So how do we participate in this, and how do we help others feel more inclusive and a sense of belonging within our group? And how do we overcome these fear and the ambiguity? And as Andrew just walked us through the model of how do we move to being supported? And one of those ways is by being a sponsor. When there are conversations going on about different members of our teams, that's actually engaging in that conversation and sharing the expertise of others. For example, if you're in a conversation, they're saying, well, Ali's new to the team and he comes from a different aspect. It's then talking about the qualities that he brings to the table, or it's talking about the value of the experience that he brings to the table. So people begin to see them in a different light rather than as a new person or outsider from the dominant culture. Then they become a part of the culture. The next piece is to be a champion, advocate for members of other underrepresented groups. One of the things that we're doing across the ODI presence is asking people to tell the stories of the interactions they've had that may help them overcome some of their unconscious biases and move them forward in terms of how they view or how they have thought of underrepresented groups that are in our work areas. Lastly, be an upstander. An upstander is really in keeping with just like our safer strategy, where when you hear something, say something. Always speak up if you witness behavior or speech that is degrading or offensive. And then a way of using that and leveraging that to get that back is to leverage our safer strategy. One of the keys to allyship is it's what can an individual do? How do I empower myself to become a part of it and leverage our Rich Ties values to help it make sense? We need to speak up as it's coming. We need to say things. So if we witness a behavior, let's say something about it. Let's share that. And in the event that it is necessary, let's report it. The safer communication strategy that comes from our patient and employee model for monitoring behaviors, we can step up And if it's inappropriate, let's address the behavior head on. Let's focus on our values. If we focus on the Rich Tides values, when I joined the organization, as we stated 6 months ago, that was the underlying foundation that helped me understand the case for diversity and the intentionality and the deliberateness of Mayo to make sure that everyone had a sense of belonging. And when we focus on our values, they help guide our actions. When we're going through this, let's explain expectations. Explain it and make sure that it's clear what I expect of you and what you expect of me and what is expected in our environments. And as I stated, in the event that it's necessary, let's report and document it. Because when we report and document it, then we can engage other resources to help us move past it. With that, I want to transition back to Laura.
So we're going to try to open this up to conversation across all 57 of the participants, because we really wanted to hear from all of you what some of the things you're hearing, what some of the things you're seeing, and eventually come to a conversation around what can we be doing across Mayo Clinic to be better allies for one another. And I think Andre and Ali talked about this earlier, is we use this opportunity because of the impact that it's having on our Asian Americans today. But if you think about the fear and the stigma, right, and how that's impacted different groups throughout the history of America even, or around the world, that fear and that stigma has a place in the actions that have been taken against those groups. And so it's not just our Asian American colleagues today. It was the LGBT population back in the scare of AIDS, right? It was, and still to a certain point today, when you think about our disabled employees and the stigma that is associated with them, whether it's physical or cognitive. And so different groups face different stigma and different fear because of the unknown. And so we're going to open it up. I'm going to try to unmute all of you. Use the space bar to unmute yourself to jump in to share a story or share some of the concerns that you have seen across Mayo Clinic, inside or outside.
Hi, Laura. This is Tamara. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for sending the information out. And this is great information. It's a relevant topic. As a matter of fact, I was speaking with my mom yesterday. My mom lives in Delaware and she's retired. And so before all this happened, she would go to the gym frequently. And she has a neighbor they recently retired from New York City. And they moved to Delaware about 6 months ago. And so that's been her gym buddy. And so my mom shared with me yesterday that her gym buddy told her that she was in the grocery store and she was just sort of, talking, and I guess people could hear her talk. And a man said to her in the store, he said, "You're from New York. Why are you here? I thought they locked everyone out from New York to coming to other states." And she was like, "Wait a minute, I've lived here for 6 months." And so I didn't think or realize that even something like that could even occur. Even people coming from different areas or may have a distinct accent, and because they're hearing about what's happening in the news in other areas, are now treating people differently from places like New York. So my mom shared that with me. I thought that was interesting. I wanted to share with the group.
Even just regional differences and the stigma that regional areas, right? So if you're from New York or Michigan or California right now, those are bad places to be from with the accents from those regional places.
Yeah, Laura, it's also interesting to me how quickly human beings will create stories in the face of ambiguity, right? Or in the face of not knowing. It's easier for me to create a story, even if it's not based on truth or reality or anything that one could even, tie to scientific experience. But because we don't know, the fear can often, that fear and ambiguity can get in the way of making rational decisions, right? The thing about the toilet paper is a great example of that, right? So toilet paper doesn't help anything. However, there was this rush to get those things, and so I think it's interesting in these times, particularly for us, how important it is for us to take a step back, take a breath, and think rationally about some of our unrational things. So Ali has his hand up.
You're very pointed, and I was just looking in the chat, and JP, you're right. All kinds of biases begin to show up. Again, when we have the steady flow of negativity on the television and trying to report on this crisis, people then begin to create, with the lack of information, their own narrative. And in creating that narrative, a lot of times, as we can see, it's not just with the Asian community now, it's people from New York. It's the borders that are going up with the travel advisories. It's whatever the catalyst is, we as humans tend to move towards the negative slant on it, rather, again, trying to have that closure with completing an answer of what we think it should be in order to deal with the fear or the unknown that we have.
So I'm curious, Dawn, and I know that you work with some of our most vulnerable parts of our population. What are you seeing as people start to think about and try to manage this COVID-19 conundrum that we kind of find ourselves in?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of reaching out yet, but I guess one of my biggest fears is our employees with disabilities that face daily mental health challenges. This added layer of stress can be quite overwhelming. One of our members reached out to me and she said, I'm just going to wear a hanky in my pocket every day as a sign that I support individuals with mental health challenges. So, if you'd have a bandana in your closet somewhere, I know I have mine in my pocket here, just letting people know that you're there for each other. And I'm sure there's lots of ways to do that. But if there's some symbolism sometimes in that invisible disability world, those small signs make a difference.
I think is how do we treat each other in times of crisis, right? So Cynthia Hingle, in your area, what are you, how are people coping with COVID-19? So Cynthia says, I think people are mostly doing okay, but everything's a little bit different. She also says she doesn't have a microphone, so that's fine. That's fine. So what do you mean things are, everything is a little bit different? So I'm going to read this directly from her chat. So she's currently typing. So Laura, do we have time for me to just share a short story while we're waiting?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So many of you know that I moved from the cities to Rochester, and I love it. Love it. My 3-minute commute, you can't beat it. But when I was in the cities, I was on the board of ACAP. Now, I think it's now 3 years ago, or 3 or 4 years, there was a freak snowstorm. So I was on the board of ACAP. We run a program called Head Start, which is, for low income people, so that their kids can have the same opportunities as people who aren't in low income. I was a part of Head Start long ago when I was a small child. At any rate, so our Head Start director recognized that there was this freak storm coming. She had already sent the buses with the kids home to their parents, and the parents were anticipating the kids coming home. She started watching the news, and she started getting reports from her bus drivers about the heaviness of the snow. And knowing how Anoka County was, knowing the roads and being familiar with that, she made a unilateral decision to bring everyone back to the school. So she said, bus drivers, I want you to turn around and bring everyone back. And so they were a bit perplexed, but they followed her direction. And some of them were like, well, I'm almost at their street. She said, I don't care where you are, bring all the children back. And so she brought all the children back, and it's about 120 kids that she brought back with all those buses and whatnot. As she's bringing those children back, there were other school districts that pushed their drivers to get those kids home. Consequently, some of those buses got stuck with 44 kids on the bus, 22 kids on the bus, elementary and pre-elementary kids stuck on the bus. for 4 and 5 hours, right? Parents couldn't locate the kids and all this kind of stuff. All sorts of, you can imagine the misery that could be happening on these buses. While our director brought all those kids back to the center. At our next board meeting, we asked, what was it that drove her? Why does she bring everyone back? And one of the things that she recognized was that she was a control freak. Those were her words, right? She said, I have such a need for control that I operate from these simple principles, that when the kids are with me, I can control what happens to them. But when they're not with me, I have no control. And she said, and the best thing for them in that situation was for them to come back. She made decisions not based on her emotional state, not based on the pressures of external forces, but really based on her principles that she needed to do what was best for those kids by operating from those principles. And I think, we kind of went through it very quickly, but I really, really believe that those rich ties values will help navigate us through this time of uncertainty, right? And so I'm curious as to people's thoughts in the chat room. Allie, do you want to read some of the things that people are saying in the chat room?
Yes, the distancing has caused a gap. This is something I got a chance to write about, share on LinkedIn and across our Facebook social groups. It is a requirement, and I wish they had used the term differently. Rather than social distancing, they had used the term physical distancing in social environments. Because through tools like Zoom, like we are today, we can still stay connected. We can even stay connected with our work groups, with our colleagues from work. But we as human beings need that ability to touch each other and continue to have those conversations. Some of the other things that are out there are, one of the many ways that we can be better allies, coming from Janina, for one another is by questioning others when we see fear-driven decisions surfacing. Questions like, what evidence do you have to make that statement? When I heard you say, whatever it is, I thought, if those words were directed at you, how would you feel? The hope is that one open-ended question could cause another to pause before speaking in the future. I think that's an excellent thought, Janina, and thanks for sharing that. I think Jowdy wanted to share, and he actually put in chat, but can we unmute him, Laura?
Hey, thanks for organizing this. This is really important, very timely discussion. So as I mentioned in my chat, there is a lot of conflicting and charged messages. And I think because of the high sensitivity and high fear among the population, people are trying to blame anything and everything at which they find. We've heard several elected officials, including the president, call this as a Chinese virus, and social media is flooded with all the slaughterhouse meat markets. But the people don't realize that there are other viruses which originate from other places, like MERS, which was the Middle Eastern, and bird flu, which originated somewhere else. So it's not only just a virus, which is the problem right now, which is to be managed, but also the fear, the epidemic of fear, which needs to be managed.
I think that's exactly it, GLT. That's why we're having this conversation, right? And someone asked, I did see people put nasty note in front of the door of Asian Americans recently. How did that make you feel? Ali asked, how does that make you feel? I think those are one incident, right? And so I think to me, what I can say is, for me, from my experience, this has heightened everything I do. Like, I take my kids still out to hike at a park nearby, not on the playgrounds, hiking trails. But even then, just thinking about, who might I run into? What might they do to me and my kids? Or when I have to run for something essential at the store, what might I do? Or make sure I don't cough too loud, or someone's going to give me the stinky eye, right? So I think that's part of the impact that it has on us.
Thank you for sharing all the stories. So I have been reading all those. There are different stories. I watching news. I heard all kinds of things going on. So my thought about this, since I have been doing some, moving beyond the bias and some other D&I related topics. In my mind, we as human beings, we all have these biases. So in certain time, we call it's unconscious bias. And then in this trial time, some unconscious bias surface and show up. And some of them, it's just unavoidable. And because the reason is lack of, I think Andrew can support me in this, lack of a knowledge and the fear. Because really, like someone posted, we really don't know where this virus come from. It come from epicenter, from a certain market or whatever, right? So I do feel this is a great time to use this opportunity to say, okay, how should we address your fear? First of all, how keep people informed. Let people know what is really going on, and also take this opportunity to address some biases. And this is the way I still feel anytime knowledge is the power. When people are better informed, they know better, they can make better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, JP. If anybody has anything to say, please either raise your hand like Andre just did there, or type something in the chat box and so that I can see it and I can unmute you, please.
So one thing, there's a body of research that suggests that we don't ever get rid of bias, but we reassign bias. And part of reassigning it requires us to be cognitive of what bias is, and to look for our unconscious bias, because if we're not continually trying to develop those things, they do creep back up, right? So I think it's interesting that Tamara talked about having a bias towards New Yorkers because of this virus, having a bias towards folks don't even know if someone is from Asia or not, but they look like a stereotype of an Asian person that they've seen. And so we have to constantly fight and reassign our biases, right? So how do we do that? We have to engage in a cognitive process to say, I'm getting this information in. Is it possible that this information is tainted or limited? Is it possible that there could be other ways to look at this information? Not to spread disinformation, but to actually try to be more critical in our thinking, because our mind, Gestalt will have us create stories that may or may not be rooted in something that is helpful for us, right?
Yeah, Andrea, just to piggyback on that, I think you're spot on. When we think about unconscious bias, a lot of times we think this is only associated with gender, orientation, race. Unconscious bias could be as simply as I prefer Harvard University over Penn State. But when it does evidence itself within the racial realm, it really does hit home. And everybody thinks that, well, I went to unconscious bias training, or I took it on my learning, and now my unconscious bias has gone away. I think to Andre's point, we carry this baggage, and there are certain triggers that cause us to go back on our life experience. It took a life of building up these unconscious biases. It takes just as much of a lifetime to overcome them. But when we become conscious of them, I'd always asked, and this is an interesting dialogue Andre and I have had, is, so if my unconscious bias is raised to my consciousness and I still continue to practice it, have I moved on into now where it's a conscious bias and now I need to embrace it? I agree with JP. The key thing is fear drives a lot of the unconscious biases that we end up carrying with us. The lack of knowing or being ignorant to a fact leads to one of the worst terms I've heard out there in my lifetime, which is prejudice. We become prejudiced or biased based upon what we don't know. So then our mind helps create a fictitious narrative. The best way to overcome that is through dialogue. The best way to understand something is to research it, start to look into it. In the Intercultural Development Index, it talks about, in order to move from one orientation within that continuum to another orientation, it takes almost 30 to 40 hours of the personal development of understanding. If we could, at this time, when we have our time, start to do some of that, to do some reflection internally about our thoughts, then we can begin to move past them. It's helping our children begin to understand and navigate this. And that begins by, again, helping them address their fears, their concerns, and then helping them to move past it and engaging in conversation. We don't always have to be experts. Sometimes it's being able to air the thought and then do the research to understand how to move in the right perspective.
So Dawn, I have you unmuted. I think you had something to say.
Well, I was just wondering what people's natural instincts are when they're in a fearful mode. Do they switch to protective? And when they're in that protective mode, they just don't have that same capacity to be mindful, to be aware, because it's just like an automatic switch. And I think that's a lot what we're talking about, but I was wondering what other people think of that.
So it looks like Dr. Bagra has typed in the chat box, survival mode is fight or flight, limbic system. So I want to be cognizant of time. We said we'd only hold you till 12:45, and we have 3 minutes left. So what I'd like you to do is this. In the chat box, after hearing people share their experiences as well as share some of the things that what we can be doing individually, I'd like for you to think about what is one thing you can take away from this conversation today, whether it's big or small, that you can start to do something differently starting tomorrow, so that we can keep advancing diversity and inclusion, whether it's breaking down those biases, having further conversations and deeper conversations, whatever that may be for you. If you can just jot one thing in there, that'd be great. Oh, and looks like Dr. Bagra has her hand up, so I'll call on her real quick.
First of all, huge thanks to you, Andre and Ali, for that excellent conversation. I just wanted to give you all a round of applause and kudos on behalf of everybody for facilitating this fantastic discussion. You gave such a great background on the hijack and the ethnocentric viewpoint. I think we all act in prospect and we learn in retrospect. There were a lot of comments about, where things could have gone wrong, and that's true. I also feel like this conversation is such a fantastic example of creating safe space for growth. And so with that in mind, and, if we all kind of truly use our prefrontal cortices, I know there are things our federal government could have done better and we could have done better, but that's what being human is all about. And collectively as a society with such conversations and truly modeling inclusive leadership, because honestly, in moments of crisis such as these, it is hard and challenging to remain inclusive. And I also want to applaud our own leadership for remaining inclusive in these moments. And much of this is obviously facilitated by our stellar team within ODI. So keeping that spirit alive, I firmly believe, I don't think there's plenty of research, scientific evidence that we need to work on our brains at all times so we are ready for the times of crises. These are not behaviors that we suddenly start adopting when we are facing crisis. So thank you all once again. I know we are tight on time. I'll keep it brief.
Thank you for those comments, ma'am. So I see a lot of conversation going on in the chat box. We'll keep it going on for a little bit here, but I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy days here to join us for the last 45 minutes and joining us in conversation and sharing your perspectives, whether it's audio or through the chat box. And this is our first run, so trial and error, and hopefully next time we can have this polished up better. But please, in the meantime, send us an email, whether it's individually to one of us or to the ODI mailbox, as far as thoughts of what we can be doing better or differently to address diversity and inclusion during these times. We'll hopefully see you again next week. Andre or Ali, anything you want to say?
Just be blessed and take care of yourselves. Practice safe distancing and continue to be socially connected. Reach out. I love what's popping up in the chat. Reach out, contact someone you haven't heard from, and just say hello. Just stay in touch. And until next week, we just wish you to be very safe. And don't forget to wash your hands. I'd love to hear some great wash your hands songs or ideas on our next chat.
And don't forget to be kind to yourself as well as be kind to others. I'm Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
This has been another episode of Speaking of Diversity and Inclusion at Mayo Clinic. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We hope that the principles and conversations that we had today, you will find helpful as we make the needs of the patient come first a reality. And so as we continue our day, we want to just say thank you so much again, and we look forward to seeing who you become as you continue your conversations about diversity and inclusion here at Mayo Clinic. I'm Andre Cohen. Have a great day.